What's up, YouTube? Hope everybody's doing okay. I know y'all get sick of me here complaining about the weather on videos on here, but it is hot. Like, it's central Mississippi. It's 100 degrees right now or something like that, and that feels like not absolutely miserable, but it's cooking. Like, I walked out to the car and was sweating by the time I got back, and that's just like in the garage. But either way, I got a voiceover league for you today of some Dimir FrogTide. And normally I follow that up with like, hey, I'm playing some Dimir FrogTide Shadow. I'm playing some Dimir Frog Shadow. That last word, as much as it pains me to say, is not in this video. So I've had people asking about like, oh, what do you think about some of the meta versions like Dimir Frog with FrogTide and no shadows, just no Street Wraith, no Bobble, no Tameo. What do you think about that? So I scoured the interwebs, looked for some ideas, and found a list that I really liked that Pygonti posted on Twitter. And had some back and forth over cards like Cling to Dust with Yuta Takahashi. And if you know anything about me and Magic, you'll know I am a Yuta Takahashi super fan. Like, I got into Magic during Lorwyn block. Fairies was the thing to be doing. Like, played Fairies in Extended, played Fairies in Modern in the early days. Big fan there. So as soon as I saw him asking about, like, Cling to Dust, I was like, this is the list I'm going to play. But Pygonti put probably 65 to 70 of this 75 together. I made a couple changes and I'll kind of go over those, but for the most part, list credit goes to them. So you can definitely go find them on Twitter if you want to see the original list. And yeah, so back onto the video. The main deck, instead of Bobble, Street Wraith, Nethergoyf, which I do really miss Nethergoyf. Even just like looking at the list now, I'm like, this really needs Nethergoyf. But beside the point, kind of like our normal Shadow list, you're kind of divided into your cantrips, your interaction, and your threats. In our cantrips, instead of Bobble Wraith, running 4 Preordain, 3 Consider, 2 Deep Analysis. I'm not a big fan of Deep Analysis. I think it's a card that is like very, very not good if you don't have the frog already. Like, you have to have the frog to discard it. And if you have the frog and you have Deep Analysis in hand, you're basically required by law to discard it, because there's going to be a lot of times you just can't cast it. So even if your opponent goes for like a fatal push on your frog, you kind of have to discard the Deep Analysis. And I'm not a huge fan of that play pattern, but I understand the strength of being able to flashback, pay 2, draw 2. It can potentially grow FrogTide. It can get you extra cards to ditch to Psychic Frog. I understand the interactions. I just don't feel comfortable with the play pattern. In the threat slot, we've got 4 copies of Orcish Bowmaster, 4 copies of Psychic Frog, 4 FrogTide, and a Subtlety. I believe Pygonti's list had 2 Subtlety, but I ended up cutting 1 for a Bloodchief's Thirst that I'll get to in a second. In the counter spells, 2 copy of Force Negation, 4 counterspell, 3 Spell Snare, and a Spell Pierce. Might have had a second Spell Pierce, I can't remember, but I've been a big fan of the counterspell Force Negation package. Spell Snare, when I played Yuta's list right after the Pro Tour, I was really impressed by Spell Snare. Just haven't really wanted it in the Shadow builds. So I thought I would try it again here. With the rise of like opposing FrogTide decks, opposing Psychic Frog decks, I think Spell Snare can get some value. 2 copies of Drown in the Loch, 4 Fatal Push, 2 Cling to Dust. I really like the Cling to Dust out of Pygonti's list. I think with like Esper Goryos running around, with Flage running around, there's some solid targets for it. And then if you're not up against one of those decks, then you can always just use it on something for a redraw. You can ditch it to Frog. You can use it on one of your own spells to grow FrogTide, something like that. Or like escape it late and maybe exile a couple instants and sorceries and grow FrogTide in a pinch. And then a Bloodchief's Thirst. I'm pretty sure I cut a subtlety or some sort of counterspell for Bloodchief's Thirst, because it might have been a force negation. Because I think that the energy matchups are so popular and so prevalent right now that you've got to have some extra interaction for them early. I think that the way most of these blue-black decks lose to the energy variants is if your opponent's able to get out on the front foot and you're just slow to react, and they get to curve out like 1 drop into 2+1, or 1 into double 1 drop on 2 into 2/1 or something on 3, and you're just not able to deluge in time, or if you do deluge, you're already down to like 12 life, and you have to deluge for 4 because your opponent had a Guide of Souls and gave something flying, and now all of a sudden you're at 8, and your opponent gets to untap and just play like a Flage and a 1-drop or something, and you're way behind. But that's kind of how I feel about that 5th 1-mana removal spell. In Shadow, we run Dismember a lot of the time there. But because our life total is a little safer in this kind of build, as you can tell by like Dark Slick Shore, double Undercity Sewers, it's a little more important to stay that way instead of just giving up that advantage. In the sideboard, 3 copies of Consign to Memory, 2 Stern Scolding, 2 Mystical Dispute, 2 Narset Parter of Veil, which I like the Narset tech. Good against the One Ring, good against Necker Dominance, good against opposing draw effect decks like Goryos and Wizards and stuff like that. Another copy of Subtlety, 3 Toxic Deluge, and 2 Break the Ice. Pygonti's list had 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse. I think I cut those for another copy of Deluge and like another copy of maybe Mystical Dispute or Stern Scolding. Just because I think those matchups are a little more popular at the moment, like opposing blue-black lists. But if you wanted to find room for some Grave Hate, I think there's a lot of flex spots in the sideboard that you could potentially cut into. Spoiler alert, if I try the list again at some point, I think Eldrazi's kind of rough, so I might just start my sideboard with like 4 Consigns and 3 or 4 Break the Ice and just fill in from there. But we'll get to that when we get to it. Otherwise, as always, thank you all so much for coming and checking out the video. The last video had a huge start to it, like views through the roof, so many new subscribers. Could not thank y'all enough for it. It definitely helps show that we're on the right track, and this is the kind of stuff that people are wanting to see and wanting to check out. So greatly appreciate that. If you're not subscribed, consider it. Doesn't cost you anything, just lets you know when new videos go live. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get into the, as the Southerners say in the heat, the meat and potatoes of the video here, so you can see what Dimir FrogTide's all about. Again, no shadows in this list, unfortunately. But maybe we could correct that in future builds. So through the power of CGI, we'll get back to our regularly scheduled deck list. And there we go. So round number 1, we are on the play. Does feel good to win some die rolls in Modern. I keep it because we got some interaction. We've got a redraw. We've got some lands. But I will go for the turn 1 preordain. Like, there's no reason to hold up just mana and not be mana efficient and play my 1-drop spell. And I know that, like, I'm looking for a threat, or I'm looking for a way to find a threat. So usually with preordain, it's a counter, or it's a cantrip that's really good when you actively know what you're looking for, because you're digging more cards deep than a lot of the other options. So in this case, knowing, oh, I want a threat, regardless of what my opponent's doing, I know I need a threat. Then I can be pretty proactive with preordain and try to find something relevant. We get to fetch up Basic Island because we're not a shadow deck. Doesn't really cost us anything to fetch the island. Makes us a little bit safer into something like Burn or an aggressive aggro deck, which turns out we were up against if this is Boros energy. So we got a Psychic Frog. This was kind of an interesting point. So my opponent shocked in a blood crypt. So I'm assuming they have a 2-drop of some sort, or double 1-drop, whatever the case may be. We are going to block with the frog, because my opponent's got to do something to deal with the frog. And if there's something as like a galvanic discharge, then I get to ditch some cards and kind of save my frog. They do have the discharge, and I started thinking about, like, do I want to save the frog, and kind of realized, oh, if they have a second discharge, they'll get to kill my frog. But if they have a second discharge, then I can just ditch like spell snares and preordains and stuff and just have a 6/6 Murktide. So this kind of works out for me regardless of how it plays out. If they do have a second removal spell for the frog, then I just have a big Murktide next turn. If they don't have a second removal spell for the frog, then I've got a big frog and a big Murktide. So we're gonna go all in on this frog. Save the spell snare in hand is the last discard. So if they do have another removal spell, I can use it. If they don't, like in this case, they were bluffing. My frog lived. I get to play a Murktide. Now I just have spell snare up, and that's pretty good in a deck full of mostly 2-drops. Flage hitting me in the face is fine. They can get back Flage next turn if they have a counter spell, but I'm hitting them to 9, and then I can always like ditch these 2 cards and grow the Murktide even more if I need to. Draw a counter spell, and I think the immediate thought for most people is, okay, I've got counter spell, they got a Flage, I can just counter the Flage and like win the game. But with this Psychic Frog Murktide combination, you have to really look into, okay, how much damage can I present here? And in this case, discarding 3 cards grows the frog by 3. So I'm up to a 7, 8, and a 5/5 Murktide. But then if I exile 3 cards to give the frog flying, and those 3, I don't know, happen to be an instant or sorcery leaving the graveyard, then Murktide Regent can get some more counters. So in this case, discarding 3 instants or sorceries, grow the frog by 3 to a 7, 8, exile them from the graveyard to give the frog flying, puts 3/1/1 counters on the Murktide Regent, and now I've got a 7, 8 and an 8, 8 Murktide, which is 15 damage, which is enough to get our opponent dead. So really cool little combo with the frog there. I know that's the kind of line that people who are really buying into the frog are interested in. My take has kind of always been like, oh, if the frog's living or the Murktide's living, I probably don't need the other. But in the case of right there, with my opponent having Flage, if I knew I had the counterspell, I would agree with that line. Since I didn't know I had the counterspell, it's a little sketchier, but we drew the counterspell anyway, so it's fine. All right, opponent's got an Ocelot Pride. This is one of these moments that I'm trying to get better about against Boros Energy, and hopefully it'll help you approach the matchup a little differently as well. The 1-drops are very problematic out of the deck. The Ocelot Prides and the Guide of Souls. Guide of Souls, I think, is actually more impactful to the matchups than Ocelot Pride, but both of them very, very good. And I've started really leaning into this idea of let me focus more on not losing tempo than maybe being too aggressive about dealing with what's on board. So in this case, I have the Fatal Push for the Ocelot Pride. I could kill it, or I can hold up Spell Snare for the 2-drop. The 2-drops, in this case, a Johnny, Amped Raptor, Unstable Amulet, are essentially all going to be 2-for-1s, where the Ocelot Pride, all I got to do is get a threat down, and I can stand in front of the Ocelot Pride. So I really want to focus on not letting my opponent get their 2-for-1s, really get those taken care of with my counter spells, focus my removals on like the 1-drops and things like that could be more problematic. Here we've got Orcish Bowmaster to shoot down the Ocelot Pride. It does kind of open up the possibility of my opponent having an impactful spell here. But if they have like a Blood Moon, I've got a second island for counterspell. If they've got a Flage, all they're killing is my Bowmaster, that's fine with me because I can have counterspell up after that. If they have like an Amped Raptor or an Ajani, I've got Fatal Push. So I'm pretty well covered. And then a lot of the holding on here is kind of trying to set up Frog plus some cards to discard to save the Frog plus Counterspell. And there's not a lot of pressure on me from my opponent here to have to play stuff out. So I'm fine getting in the chip damage with the Bowmasters, saving some cards in hand for the Frog. I really wanted to get up to those 4 lands so I could double Counterspell or Frog plus Counterspell. And now that I've drawn the Murktide, if the game had gone another turn, I would have felt a lot more comfortable playing out a Frog, ditching some stuff to save it from like a Flage or a Bolt or something, and then just playing a big Murktide with Counterspell backup. Because if they had to put in a lot of resources to deal with the Frog, then there's a really good chance that Murktide is just going to close out the game from there. But either way, win that one. On to match number 2. Opening hand there, no lands, easy throwback. Second hand, kind of like I said that round or game 1 of round 1. We know Preordained's trying to find a threat. Subtlety's like threat adjacent. So going ahead and preordaining is kind of fine with me. Happen to find our way into a Psychic Frog. Looks like we're in some sort of a blue-black, maybe Frog mirror. So they go for a Frog. Pretty easy subtlety on my spot. Most of the reasoning here is if my opponent resolves a Frog, then 1, I don't have an answer to it in hand, and 2, their Frog can get substantially bigger than my Frog. Since I'm on a mulligan, I was on the play. They've got 6 cards in hand to my 4, so I can't really like aggressively attack into that, because if I do and they block, every card I discard they can match. And then still end up ahead on cards and still end up with a bigger Frog than I do. So instead, we're going to Subtlety the Frog. They put it on top, and now I get an attack in with the Frog, plus I can hold up Counterspell, so I can deal with it on the way back down, and hopefully if they spend their turn just playing the Frog, I can kind of regain some momentum there. Going for the Spell Snare there, partially so I don't get hit back with like a Spell Pierce or something with their 1 mana open. Surveil before the Frog connects sees a Murktide Regent, so I know I need to discard a card to get the Murktide online. Discarding the island gives me like a free point of damage on the Psychic Frog, lets me get down the Murktide, and I can save that Flooded Strand to go get another Undercity Sewers. So Archaeologist means it's not a blue-black Frog mirror. It is in fact Goryo's Vengeance. I did not know. This Surveil here, I could have Surveilled at the end of their turn, but I didn't want them to just freely resolve an Ephemerate if they wanted to. So I went to my turn instead so that I could Surveil on my upkeep, have Fatal Push. Maybe I find like, forget, I gotta plug in this headset. Surveil on my upkeep so that if I find something like a Fatal Push, I can use it and have Counterspell backup for the known Ephemerate. If I fetched at the end of their turn, there's a chance they could have just Ephemerated right then and there, gotten some free value, and I don't want them to have free value when we're in this close of a game. So Surveil them up to keep, see Cling to Dust, and decide to keep that because it's pretty good at fighting over like an Atraxa in the yard. Here's the Ephemerate. Counterspell that because we don't want our opponent being able to just get ahead on the card advantage. Then of course they have another Ephemerate. Get back a Tainted Indulgence. Really hoping they go for a Goryo's right here. And they do. We have the Cling to Dust. opponent scoops, because we can go to our turn, discard whatever card we draw, and then exile 3 to give the frog flying. So we have lethal and our opponent's tapped out. Clearly they did not have a solitude. So good job, Frog. Sideboarding. I didn't really talk about sideboarding against Boros. That one's pretty straightforward. Like, most of your removal spells are coming in, your deluges, stern scoldings, things like that. And you're boarding out things that can get you 2 for 1. So, like Force Negation, I usually take out. Psychic Frog, I usually trim on. Might not take out all of them, but it's not very good, especially on the draw. Against Goryo's Vengeance, most of my spot removals coming out. I might leave in a Fatal Push or something to interact with a Grief or an Archaeologist. Bring in Stern Scolding because it counters Grief, it counters Solitude, counters Archaeologist, counters Psychic Frog. And then mostly past that, like any counter spells you got. Hard counters, not like Consign to Memory countering an ETB trigger. But like, this blue-black already has such a problem dealing with big creatures that you don't want to consign like an Atraxa ETB, because now you just spent a card and you still can't deal with the Atraxa. So instead, just like focusing on keeping the Atraxa off the board, it's a lot more effective. Opponent Thoughtseizes themselves, reveals the Goryo's Vengeance. Clearly we do not have an answer to that. So we preordain to try to find a Force Negation, don't hit it, and the opponent just has turn 2 Goryo's Vengeance on a Griselbrand. And if you've ever played against Griselbrand, you know we're pretty much behind and dead now, and there's not a lot we can do. So try to find a second land, we don't hit it, on to the next game. Short, sweet, to the point. On to game number 3. Keep a hand with some cantrips, little interaction. It's really slow clock. This is one of the reasons that I've been off of Bowmaster a good bit in recent Shadow builds. Is it's just not very fast. I could have Bowmastered like on my turn to make sure it was down before this Tainted Indulgence. But at the end of the day, I'd rather them not resolve like an Archaeologist right there. So I'm fine holding up the mana and missing the ability to get 2 more Bowmaster pings. And then a lot of turns with a deck like this where I'm tapping out. Even if I have Counterspell, a lot of times I'll tap down low, and it's because I know what my opponent's deck is capable of doing at certain mana intervals. So, for example, my opponent having 3 lands, no big threat in the yard, means that their hand would have to be exactly like Thoughtseize, Big Thing, Goryo's Vengeance to be able to go off here. But if they don't, if they have like a Tainted Indulgence or a, what's the Faithful Mending, something like that, that's going to take 2 mana. Goryo's Vengeance is going to take another 2. So they're not going to be able to do both of those things this turn. So for that reason, I'm okay tapping a little low just to get something proactive out. Psychic Frog here with Mystical Dispute means I can fight over Faithful Mending, over Tainted Indulgence. Keep something on top. And I can also fight over Teferi. We will take that one. And now, just kind of like I said in game 1, we have the bigger frog, so we can attack in pretty freely. Opponent can't really fight the frog discard battle. We'll chill with double counterspell. Frog does make it so that they can discard pretty easily to get frog triggered, or like get something online for Goryo's Vengeance, or in this case, Priest of Fellrights. I'm just kind of hoping that I can get them down low enough life total wise to where the priest doesn't matter. That's why we flashed in Bowmaster and pinged before they hit us and got to draw a card. Alright, on the draw, we do have a Sink into Stupor, so this isn't a no land keep. contrary to popular belief. And then they played the turn 1 Elegant Parlor. I was so sure this was another energy matchup, but it turns out we're up against Ruby Storm, which makes this substantially worse. I was looking at like Bloodchief's Thirst, Spell Snare. Like, oh, if this is Boros, I've got some cheap interaction for some 2-for-1s. But Storm means we are, like I said, pretty far behind. Then, yeah, there's the Past in Flames. So scoop to that because they have multiple rituals. They have Ren's Resolve and Reckless Impulse. We'll just go to game 2. Now that we know what we're up against. Sideboarding. Not much to say about sideboarding. Like, blue-black decks usually pretty okay against the Storm decks. Stern Scolding hits Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ral. Force of Negation hits most of their deck. And those are my big bring-ins. And then I might bring in like a Consigned to Memory or 2 because it hits Ruby Medallion. It can hit Storm Trigger off of like a Grape Shot or a Galvanic Relay. Just a little extra interaction. In the Shadow decks, I usually won't even bring in Consigned to Memory because with Thoughtseize and Shadow ending the game quickly, you really don't need it. But with this Dimir list here, I'm a little more interested in kind of boarding in what I can. Ruby Medallion needs a Force. Now, they could have had a Ral there, and it would have been unfortunate for the home team, but thankfully they didn't. They also missed a land here, so we see they have Ral and Ruby Medallion in exile. I can pretty safely play a Frog because I have Stern Scolding or Spell Snare, depending on what they do. Okay, we're going to talk about a bit of the consideration here real quick. As you notice, my opponent went for a Pyretic Ritual, and I let it resolve before going for the Spell Snare on the Ruby Medallion. And you're probably thinking, like, why do that? Why not, like, counter the Pyretic Ritual and just stop the entire turn? And the reason being is, against Storm, you're playing a resource battle. And the more cards that your opponent has in hand, the more things they have access to, the more potential lines they have available to get out of whatever kind of corner you have them backed into. So my hope with letting the first Pyretic Ritual resolve is if my opponent had a land, they probably play the land first. And then I would more than likely just counter the first Pyretic Ritual because I don't want to counter one and then have them be able to play another 2-drop. But if I let the Pyretic Ritual resolve and they don't have the land, then one of two things happens. They either cast one of the 2-drops from exile, in this case, the Ruby Medallion. I've got the Spell Snare. Same thing as if I just countered the Pyretic Ritual, right? Like, the Ritual's in the graveyard, Spell Snare's in the graveyard. In this case, Ruby Medallion's in the graveyard too. Nothing lost. Best case scenario is my opponent says, okay, well, I'm going to cast another card from hand, another Pyretic Ritual, a Ren's Resolve, something like that, and I get to counter that, in which case now my opponent's down 2 cards in hand, plus they don't get the 2 things from exile for the 1 Spell Snare that would have just gotten 1 thing in hand, and they'd still have another, say, Ritual or Ren's Resolve or whatever in hand. So the upside is that I get another card out of my opponent's hand. The downside is that if they were sandbagging a land, I would be in some amount of trouble, but I'm kind of in some trouble if they hit land drops anyway, so we'll just kind of roll with it. So they did have a Dragon's Rage Channeler for that last mana, so they did have something they could do with it, but because I have Frog that can kind of like pop through some damage, I'm not in too bad of a spot. And then here, since I have the Frog active, they have to attack with the Channeler. I'm going to make this like a 2-turn clock very easily. I'm much more inclined to just go for the damage, counter whatever they put on the stack if I can. And hope I can Stern Scolding like a Ral. Reckless Impulse is fine because they don't have any mana floating, so even if they find a land, they probably can't play anything else unless it's another Channeler. And I've got Stern Scolding for that. So on to game 3 against Storm. Pretty decent hand on the draw. We have interaction for creatures, which is really nice. Hold up Spell Snare here to try to fight over like a Ruby Medallion or a Ral. And I'm letting this resolve because they can't cast any of these this turn. And I'm hoping that I can just like consider, try to find another land, set myself up for future turns instead of fighting over the Dragon's Rage Chandler and having to use my mana on my turn to cantrip. This almost identical situation to the ritual from last turn. Or last game. Was it last game? Yeah. Where I want to get my opponent using more resources. And you have to remember against like Ruby Storm, increments of 2. Always think in increments of 2. 2 mana for your Ruby Medallion and your Ral. 2 mana for your rituals. 2 mana for your Ren's Resolve effects. Always in increments of 2. So if I Fatal Push the Ral in response to this Pyretic Ritual, there's no mana on the stack, my opponent's already played their land drop, then they're at 3 mana. 3 mana is divisible by 2 once with a remainder. So 1 time, remainder of 1. 1 is not 2. The likelihood of them being able to double spell off of 2 and 1, extraordinarily low. So if I kill the Ral, let the Pyretic Ritual resolve, there's a really good chance my opponent's going to cast something else from hand, and then I can fight over with the rest of my hand. And I just made them use another resource that I wouldn't have gotten out of hand if I just countered the Pyretic Ritual, because I knew, oh, they're at 3 mana. They're probably not going to be able to double spell or punish me for seeing one more thing. If it's another ritual effect, I'm probably countering it because I don't want them to get to 4. Because then, hey, increments of 2, they can double spell. But instead, they do go for a Ruby Medallion, which we're happy as heck to get that off the stack. Now we're land finding mode, kill off the Dragon's Rage Channeler because we have the Spell Snare. If our opponent doesn't do anything impactful, we can Cling to Dust the Past in Flames to get that out of the yard. Find another Spell Snare, so now's Flash and Bowmaster time. Try to get the game over with, even if this is a very, very slow clock. But we'll just sandbag counter magic as much as we can. Since we do have the Bowmaster down and another Bowmaster in hand, plus multiple counter spells, that's why I'm like really aggressive about counting this Reckless Impulse. My opponent just spent 2 turns not doing anything. So I'm going to start using my counters pretty aggressively, because if 3 or 4 of their cards in hand aren't impacting the game, then I want to, get the game over with, not let them build up any momentum. So yeah, get that Ren's Resolve out of here. Then finding a land pretty much wraps things up, because that means I have access to double counter spells. I have a clock that's wrapping up the game, even if they have like a the prison, static prison. And this Pyretic Ritual I'll counter just because they can't make anything else happen with 1 mana. So on to match number 4, I believe. 4, we're on the play. Preordain finds another land, so we're kind of rolling with our mana now. Up against an energy deck. Oh boy. Ocelot Pride. Decide to kill off the guide so they can't gain life off the Pride. And I do have Bowmaster to kind of fight over one of these Ocelots, or maybe both of the Ocelots. Maybe this was greedy, but I end up going for the double block just to try to get the Ocelot off the board, hoping that their follow-up is like a sorcery speed creature or a Flage or something, and they would just have no board presence. Unfortunately, they did have a Bowmaster, so they were able to ping my Bowmaster, gain a life, and get the Ocelot Pride going. But even if that happened, if it was worst case scenario, I still did, like you see here, get to untap with Murktide plus Counterspell. And that's a pretty good spot to be in. And now the priority for counterspells needs to become like 2-for-1s as much as possible. I know they've got a Chthonian Nightmare in hand. This draw step, I find Bloodchief's Thirst, and that kind of gets the wheels spinning, because now if I'm able to use up my spells, my Bloodchief's Thirst and my Drown in the Loch, I've got 3 cards in the yard, 4 lands. I can hit my opponent for 6 this turn, get them to 9, and then my 3 instants and sorceries in the yard getting exiled gets this Murktide up to a 9/9. So I would be able to attack for lethal next turn. So I'm killing off the Ocelot for 2 reasons. One, it gives them lifelink, and I can't have them going up to 10 or my entire line doesn't work. The other reason is it flips a Johnny. So if I decide I don't want to go for the attack at them, I can just kill a Johnny and get it off the board. And if my opponent thinks of that, then there's a chance they won't flip a Johnny, because it is a May ability. And if they don't flip a Johnny, then they can go to their turn. They can Nightmare away like a cat token, get something back and flip a Johnny. But they don't have a red permanent to shoot me or shoot down the Murktide. So as long as I save this Drown in the Loch for any red permanent, then they can't kill my Murktide. I can play another one next turn. If they do nothing, then I just kill whatever into turn. So, opponent chooses not to flip the Ajani. Like I said, it is a May ability. They don't have to. And then this is going to get interesting. So, they start off with Chthonian Nightmare. My immediate thought is they're going to sacrifice one of the cat tokens and get back like an Ocelot Pride or something, maybe a Guide of Souls, and flip the Ajani. If they flip the Ajani and go to make a token, then I can respond. Let's say they Chthonian Nightmare, get back Guide of Souls. If they flip the Ajani, go to make a token, then I have to respond with Drown in the Loch, kill the Guide of Souls. And they won't have a red permanent out or anything. If they get back Guide of Souls and play a red permanent, then I'm in a little bit of trouble, because I can't counter the red permanent and deal with the Guide of Souls. But if I kill the Ajani, like if they go for the Nightmare, sack a cat token to get back something, and I go to kill the Ajani right then and there, then I risk my opponent having a creature to follow up to gain a life off the Guide of Souls, and the whole plan falls apart there. So a bunch of ways that everything falls apart. So I'm kind of hoping to find a sequence that I can interact with Drown and not have my opponent gain life and not risk them having a red permanent and killing my Murktide. So they flip the Ajani. I flip the Ajani, play the Nightmare back. This is surprisingly a good scenario for me, because it means that they do have to commit to something. Unfortunately, if I kill the Guide in response to either one of these, they can use the other to get the Guide back. So I really want them to use the Nightmare first so that I can just kill the Guide of Souls and not have to worry about it. This was bad. I should not have killed the Guide of Souls in combat here. I should have waited until second main phase and made them make the first move, because now my opponent attacks for 3 and they could like Nightmare away the cat token, get back the Guide of Souls, make a cat, and they gain a life. And the entire plan doesn't work. If I wait until second main, it doesn't matter if they give one of these flying, because they can only give flying to an attacking creature. If I wait to second main and they start off their second main with a Johnny make a cat, I can respond with kill the Guide of Souls, and they get the cat. They don't gain life. Then they can Nightmare back a Souls. If they start with Nightmare sack something, then I can respond with or does Chthonian Nightmare target? We're going to look this up in the middle of the video. That's something I should absolutely know. Chthonian Nightmare. Sack a creature, return it to its owner's hand, return target creature card with mana value extra. Yeah, so Chthonian Nightmare does target. So I can wait for them to pay the energy, sack the creature, bounce the Nightmare, and then target something, and then drown and lock the Guide of Souls, and they can't change their target. So this was almost a huge punt on my part. I say almost a huge punt because our opponent is nice enough to a Johnny first and then Nightmare back the Souls so they don't gain the life, and I'm able to untap and just play out the FrogTide and present lethal. So very, very lucky on our part. I always hate situations like that where I'm like, okay, I'm going to punt my play over to you, and all you got to do is sequence things optimally and you get there. And that didn't happen. But if my opponent had sequenced correctly, I'd probably just like kill the Ajani, hope for the best from that point. Either way, game 2 on the draw. No spot removal makes this really bad. I really think this is a matchup where I need to start accepting that if an opening hand does not have, especially on the draw, if an opening hand does not have Stern Scolding, Fatal Push, or Bloodchief's Thirst, I just have to throw it back. I have to be able to interact with a 2-drop on turn 2 with 1 mana, Stern Scolding, or interact with a 1-drop on turn 1, Bloodchief's Thirst or Fatal Push. I think anything else probably needs to be an auto mole. Because just like this, if your opponent is able to get ahead on board, it makes life so much more difficult. Trying to catch up with a frog in the face of like Static Prison is horrendous. Discarding cards just to try to get FrogTide online so I have a follow-up threat, but with our opponent having 1-drop into 2-drop into 1/2, and 2 of those being 2-for-1s with the Raptor and the Ajani, even though the Raptor was just getting energy, it got enough to give the Guide of Souls flying and now give the Amped Raptor flying. So just finding those back-to-back like puts you so far behind. There's no possible way to catch up. So really need to focus on that early interaction in the matchup. Then this hand, very slow, but I've got Deluge and I've got Spell Snare for turn 2 for a 2-drop. So I'm kind of hoping that if I counter something on turn 2, I can just buy myself a turn to get this Deluge down. Now if they have like double Ocelot Pride here, I can deluge away the board and not feel bad about it. If they're just attacking for 1 with guide, that's fine. There's the Ocelot. Keep the Bowmaster because it kind of allows us to play this continual waiting game without having to commit too much. Like, I really want them to put more stuff on the stack. Or more stuff on the battlefield. Unfortunately, with Amped Raptor, I kind of have to counter it because it is a 2-for-1. So if they hit like a Flage or a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or something like that, it's ungodly bad for me. So I'd rather just counter it. Gonna jump a cat token into the air. So a little extra life that I have to spend, but our opponent is missing their 3rd land drop. Since they go to our turn, we're just going to immediately Windmill Slam a FrogTide Regent, so they can't Spellbomb us off of it. Definitely one of those situations where I feel like our opponent should kind of recognize, oh, FrogTide's bad for me. Let me just crack the Spellbomb and not worry about the drawing a card to keep the FrogTide off the battlefield. But alas, they do not. Still missing their land drop, so we'll get in an attack. I think go ahead and deluge away the board and figure, okay, I've got Subtlety plus a pitch card to kind of keep them off the battlefield for a turn. 2 drops pretty great because that means I can blink that and have Spell Snare for it coming back down the next turn. And I'm ditching the FrogTide because they have this Nihil Spellbomb that I can't do anything into. So, opponent exiles my yard. I thought they were going to pay for the Spellbomb, but then they didn't. So now it's just Frog versus whatever they put forward. Pretty good for the Frog deck. Little Bowman, so we'll just ditch cards, hop the Frog on up over the Bowmaster. They can ping it for 1 if they want. That's fine with me. I'm trying to just put my opponent on like a 2-attack clock. And now with the counter spell, I know that I've got the draw off of the Frog right there. I've got the counter spell. If I use one of these, great. If not, I've got 3 cards to discard, hop the Frog again, attack over for lethal. So I'm just hoping that my opponent gives me something that I can counterspell here, and that would pretty much guarantee lethal. So Amped Raptor, yeah, 100%, that's getting countered. Now I can just ditch Fatal Push, ditch the card I draw, it gives me 3 in the graveyard, exile for the Frog, hop up, fly over. So, on to our trophy match. Match number 5, Gemstone Cavern, Devourer of Destiny. I've heard people talk about the Eldrazi matchup with blue-black, saying that it's like basically impossible. I do think this is one of the matchups that having Shadow and Thoughtseize shines like an extraordinary amount. Yeah, Chalice of the Void sucks a lot more against Shadow, but being able to play Thoughtseize into like a very big threat, a quick clock, is extremely relevant. But if you want some extra tools in the matchup, you could always run Harbinger of the Seas. As long as you accept that having some number of lands not producing blue can be an issue. Was considering there to try to find a Force of Negation to counter that. Unfortunately, we did not. So Thought-Knot Seer is definitely going to get counterspelled. Not really sure what my opponent's build is. It looks like one of these Sowing Myco Spawn style Eldrazi variants. And the same that I've said for Shadow applies here, where I think like the more creatures your opponent plays, the worse it gets for you. Opponent does not graft onto our Bowmaster, unfortunately. So attack in here. I thought this attack was pretty free, honestly. I didn't think my opponent was going to, like, make a dude and put the counter on it. Boo for me, I guess. Like, I don't think the Bowmaster really matters in this matchup. So I'm not upset or anything. Then they play a Blade of the Bloodchief, or they get a Blade of the Bloodchief off Urza Saga. If you haven't seen this card, whenever a creature dies, put a 1/1 counter on an equipped creature. If the equipped creature is a vampire, it gets 2 1/1 counters instead. So I was like, okay, they got Malevolent Rumble. They've got stuff that makes Scion tokens, and they sack all the Scions and make some big dudes. Like, that's kind of cool, I think. I feel like you'd rather have a Shadow Spear or something there, but to each their own. Like, I can see if they're playing Kozilek's Command or something, making a bunch of tokens, sacking all those tokens off to play something big. You just make, like, one of your other Eldrazi huge. So, I'm not, like, entirely sure how good that card is, but I also don't play Eldrazi, so... And I'm sure a bunch of people are, like, listening to this thought process and going, like, you idiot. You should know something's up when your opponent plays Blade of the Bloodchief. But I was like, here. Opponent just Kozilek's commanded. They made some tokens. They sack the tokens and they get, like, free counters on it. Maybe they got a big trampling Eldrazi. Maybe they throw it onto a Reality Smasher or something. Like, again, that's cool, I guess. I don't know if it's better than the other options, but this is what I had to go off of game one. I don't know. Everybody can mock me in the comments all they want, but I'm sorry, I don't know all the Eldrazi brews running around. So, sideboarding, consign to memory, break the ice, a prayer. Opponent's got Cavern into Devourer again. So, pretty consistent Gemstone Caverns for them. It's unfortunate, but that's the way the Eldrazi cookie crumbles. We do not find a second land, so we're sitting here with a Consign and a Prayer, hoping for like a Thought-Knot Seer. If our opponent's main phasing Kozilek's Command, I can almost guarantee they don't have another land, so we're absolutely consigning that, hoping to keep it that way. Now, we've got a Glaring Fleshraker, and the only reason that I know what this card does is I have won draft games never having attacked because of this card. So it says whenever you cast a colorless spell, you make an Eldrazi spawn. And then whenever a colorless creature enters, you can ping your opponent for one. So it's really good in draft with stuff like the... What is it? The Withering dude, the 2 red-green that makes 3 spawns, and there's a bunch of others that make like 1 or 2. Some of the cheap green dudes that make a dude. And you can just like ping your opponent out for insane amounts of damage by using the Eldrazi spawn that you create to cast more Eldrazi, that trigger it, that make more spawn, that you can sack to make more Eldrazi, and it's hilarious. But at this point, I was kind of like, okay, this might be some sort of combo deck. Like, you're making a bunch of Scions, you're sacking a bunch of Scions. That's, again, neat. I don't know how good it is, but it's a concept I have not seen before. Subtlety of Thought-Knot, ditch an extra Murktide, because if I hit a land, I would love to get down a Murktide or hold up Counterspell. As we see, that is exactly what we're going to do. Because if their best follow-up is just like another Thought-Knot Seer, then I don't feel so bad. They play a Basking Broodscale, Devoid, Adapt 1. Whenever a 1/1 counter is put on it, you make a Eldrazi spawn. It's like, okay, we'll make spawns, I guess. And yeah, so I draw Fatal Push, and I know everybody in the comment section is flaming me over this, if you know what's going on. Because I'm sitting here with a Drown in the Lock and a Fatal Push, being like, okay, whatever, I'm going to play a Frog. I'm going to get this game over with. I'm going to ditch 4 cards and exile them to FrogTide, and give this frog flying, and I'm just going to kill my opponent next turn. Lo and behold, there is a combo here. This Basking Broodscale with Blade of the Bloodchief means that if they adapt it and they make a Scion, they can sack the Scion for a mana, trigger the Blade of the Bloodchief that puts a 1/1 counter on the creature it's attacked to, in this case a Basking Broodscale, that says whenever a 1/1 counter is put onto it, you make an Eldrazi spawn. So you sack the spawn, put a counter on it, make another spawn. Every time you sack a spawn, you get a colorless mana. So you can go infinite with your colorless mana there. You also get infinite ETB and death triggers if you want to do something with that. So I was like, okay, they got infinite colorless mana. Like, if you use it all to cast a Thought Knot, I still kill you. Then they played a Flesh Raker, and I was like, oh, you're just going to keep looping, making dudes, pinging me for 1 until I'm dead. Touche, opponent. Touche. So if you see me post about that in the Discord, I had no clue what was going on. I was so completely lost, I can't even begin to fathom how I ever would have pieced together that's what was happening. I should assume when I see Blade of the Bloodchief that it's going to be a combo with something, but I had no idea what it was comboing with. I literally thought it was just a value card, like make a bunch of spawns. Oh, here's something that combos with making and sacking a bunch of spawns. Sure as heck does combo. So let's talk about the list. For the main deck, 4 Murktide still feels like a lot to me, but I get the benefit of being able to discard them to frogs and pitch them to like subtlety and force negation. So I don't think it's a bad thing if you see some of these other spells. Maybe going up on subtlety or force is the right call. I know Pygonti, I think, was running more than I was. But again, I wanted to devote that extra spot to Bloodchief's Thirst, which we did see energy twice. Spell Snare was great. Counterspell, great. Pierce is fine. Drown's fine. Bowmaster, I don't think does like anything on the draw side. The clock is slow. I get that it's a value piece, and there's probably a chance that you just have to play it in a build like this. But I've been happy with not having them in my shadow decks. So take that with a grain of salt. Deep Analysis, I still think is unplayable. I wish it came up more that you could like discard and flash it back. But games just don't work that way. Like, I think Deep Analysis is this great theory card where you're like, oh, I'm going to ditch it and flash it back and it's going to be great. But actual games just don't follow that pattern more often than not. They're more about, I got to hold up my mana for counterspells. I can't afford to pay 2 and draw 2. What if I don't see my 4th and 5th land? Like, I can't tap out on my turn to flash back Deep Analysis. And yeah, that's just my 2 cents on that. But if you're a big Deep Analysis fan, then I say go crazy, keep playing it. But I think I'm very quickly going to cut it for something else. I just haven't decided what yet. In the sideboard, the Narsets are cool. I like them. I wish I saw more good Narset matchups, but I do think the card's pretty all right. Again, I mentioned at the start of this video, I would go up Consigns and Break the Ice. I think Eldrazi is a popular enough matchup and a bad enough matchup that I would be okay devoting some extra resources to it. And that could even mean like swapping an island for a swamp and playing Harbinger. But possibilities are all there. Everything's on the table. Other than that, yeah, fun deck. Give it a shot. Let me know what you think. Hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you all so much for coming and checking out the video. And as always, being so supportive with the likes, the comments, the shares. greatly helps grow the channel and let me know we're going the right direction. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.